It was just another quiet Tuesday morning in the small town of Fairview. The streets were calm, the sun was out, and the daily rhythm of life had begun. Coffee shops opening, school buses rolling by, and officers gathering outside the precinct for their usual morning banter. Officer Jake Collins, a 12-year veteran of the Fairview Police Department, leaned against a patrol car with a smirk on his face and a coffee in his hand. Known for his rough attitude and questionable sense of humor, Jake often walked the line between old-school cop and outright bully. He laughed loudly with two other officers about last night's football game, oblivious to how his loud voice echoed off the nearby buildings. Just then, a tall, sharply dressed black man walked past them on the sidewalk. He was wearing a crisp navy blue suit, polished shoes, and carried himself with a quiet confidence. He looked directly at the group, gave a courteous nod, and continued toward the coffee shop door. But for reasons known only to him, Jay Collins felt something stir inside. Maybe it was arrogance, racism, or just the unchecked power of someone who never faced consequences. "Hey," Jay called out. The man stopped briefly, turned his head slightly, confused but calm. And then it happened. With a mocking laugh, Officer Collins spat, deliberately, directly, right at the man's shoes. The saliva landed on the man's left shoe, shining in the sunlight like an open wound. There was a moment of pure silence. Even Jake's fellow officers froze. It was one of those moments where time seems to stop. People walking on the sidewalk slowed down. A woman sitting by the coffee shop window stared wide-eyed. Someone across the street fumbled for their phone, unsure if they had just witnessed something illegal or just deeply disgusting. The black man slowly looked down at his shoe. Then, without a word, he pulled a small cloth from his pocket, calmly wiped it clean, and looked directly into Jake Collins' eyes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He simply said, "You've made a mistake. A big one." Then he turned around, walked into the coffee shop, and disappeared inside. Officer Collins chuckled, trying to brush it off. "Guy thinks he's somebody," he muttered. "Probably some big city lawyer or something." But the nervous glances between the other officers told a different story. One of them whispered, "You shouldn't have done that, man. That was bad." Collins shrugged. "Relax. Who's gonna care?" He would soon find out. Because what Officer Collins didn't know, and what he would come to regret deeply, was that the man he had just spat on wasn't just a passerby or some fancy businessman from out of town. That man was David Brooks, a former FBI investigator, a decorated officer, and the newly appointed chief of police for Fairview. And he hadn't come to town just for coffee. He was there to clean house. In just a few hours, Collins would be standing in the department's main briefing room, waiting to meet the new chief everyone had been whispering about for weeks. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could prepare him for the moment when that same man he'd humiliated earlier would walk through the door and stand at the podium. The man who had just been spat on was no stranger to disrespect. But this wasn't just a random insult. It was a challenge, a warning sign of the deep-rooted problems he had come to fix. His name was David Brooks, a former FBI field agent, a Harvard-educated criminal justice expert, and a nationally recognized reform strategist. He had worked in some of the toughest cities across the country: Newark, Baltimore, Detroit, places where corruption ran deep and racism was baked into the system. But every time, he had left those departments better than he found them. So why Fairview? On the surface, the town looked peaceful, low crime, charming downtown, friendly residents. But under that polished surface, something was rotting. Complaints against officers were piling up. Use of force reports were misplaced. Citizens of color were being stopped and searched disproportionately, but nothing was ever done. The mayor, under growing pressure from both the community and the media, knew something had to change. So he reached out to someone who didn't just talk about reform. He lived it. David Brooks accepted the offer. Quietly. No press, no parades. Just boots on the ground. He wanted to see the town for what it really was, before anyone knew who he was. And that's exactly what he was doing the morning Officer Collins spit on him. He had arrived early. No police escort. No badge. Just a man in a suit walking the streets of a town he was about to take charge of. He wanted to feel the air, meet the people, Observe how the officers interacted with citizens when they thought no one important was watching. That's why he had nodded respectfully at the officers, trying to get a read on their demeanor. But instead of professionalism, he was met with open hostility. He hadn't even said a word, and yet, one of them decided he didn't deserve basic human decency. Spat on him. In broad daylight. With witnesses around. Most people would have snapped. Called him out. Demanded an apology, or even pressed charges. But not David Brooks. He understood something far more powerful than outrage. Timing. Why waste energy arguing with a man whose days on the force were already numbered? So he calmly wiped his shoe, made his way into the cafe, and ordered his drink like nothing had happened. But inside, his thoughts were sharp, focused. If this is how they act in public, he thought, what are they doing behind closed doors? The coffee shop staff, unaware of the situation outside, greeted him kindly. He paid in cash, thanked them with a smile, and quietly left. Back in his rental car, he made a few notes on his phone. Officer, white male, mid-40s, buzz cut, name tag Red Collins. Incident, spitting verbal insult. Witnesses, at least 4, including civilians. Reaction, no apology, no hesitation. He saved the file under one word, culture, because that's what it was. This wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a culture that allowed a badge to become a weapon of power and prejudice. By noon, the town's police department had been notified of a mandatory staff meeting. Officers were told the new chief would be introduced in person. Some were excited, others skeptical. Officer Collins, still feeling smug about his morning joke, walked into the meeting room like he owned it. Leaned back in his chair. Smirked. He had no idea what was coming. When a mayor stepped up to the mic and said, "Please welcome the new chief of police, Mr. David Brooks." The room went silent. And when David Brooks walked in, the exact same man Collins had disrespected that very morning. Not in uniform, but in total control, a shockwave went through the room. Collins sat up, blinking in disbelief. His jaw clenched. His face drained of color. He had spat on the wrong man. And David Brooks? He walked up to the podium, calm and unshaken, just like before. He didn't even look at Collins. Not yet, but everyone in that room could feel it. This department was about to change. Starting now. As the new police chief, David Brooks stood in front of the department's officers with calm authority. The room was packed. Dozens of officers, detectives, clerks, and command staff sat upright, watching the man they had just been told would lead them. For some, this was exciting. They'd heard of Brooks, his work cleaning up corrupt precincts, his national reputation for community reform, and his zero-tolerance stance on abuse of power. Others were nervous, and a few, like Officer J. Collins, were downright terrified. Collins was sitting toward the back, suddenly pale, sitting rigid in his chair. He tried to look casual, but his fingers tapped anxiously on the armrest. Just that morning, he'd spit on the man now standing behind the podium. Chief Brooks took a moment to look around the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound the table. He simply started speaking, with controlled fire behind every word. "Let's get one thing out of the way," he said. "I didn't come here to shake hands and smile for photo ops. I came here because your community has lost trust in you. And from what I've already seen, that trust was lost for good reason." The room was dead silent. "I've read the complaints. I've studied the numbers. I've watched the footage. And this morning, even before I put this badge on, I got a front row seat to the exact kind of behavior I'm here to stop." I turned toward the back of the room, toward Collins. Chief Brooks didn't say his name. He didn't have to. Instead, he paused, leaned slightly forward and said, "Some of you have already introduced yourselves quite clearly." That line hit like a grenade. Collins looked down, swallowing hard. One of the officers sitting near him shifted uncomfortably in their seat. A few exchanged nervous glances. Some even seemed relieved, like someone had finally shown up who wasn't afraid to speak the truth. Brooks continued, "This isn't a witch hunt. I know not everyone in this department is part of the problem. Some of you took this job to protect people, not intimidate them. But here's the reality. Good cops can't survive in bad systems. And if you've been silent while your co-workers abuse their badge, then you're not as innocent as you think." He stepped away from the podium and began walking slowly across the front of the room. I believe in second chances. But second chances only work when people are willing to change. Starting today, we're reviewing every active complaint. We're reopening files that were accidentally closed. And we're bringing in outside observers to help clean up what's been ignored for years. Then he stopped walking, turned, and looked directly at the back of the room, at Collins. Because the culture of this department will not be built on fear, disrespect, or unchecked egos. He let that sentence hang in the air. No shouting, no anger, just truth delivered with unshakable conviction. Brooks walked back to the podium, looked over the room one last time, and said, "For those of you doing your job with honor, I got your back. But for those who wear this badge like a license to dominate rather than serve, your time is up." He stepped away. There was no applause, just silence. Heavy, uncomfortable silence. But in that silence, something had shifted. People realized this wasn't just another chief giving another speech. This was a man who had already been tested, and he didn't flinch. He'd been spat on and didn't raise his voice. He'd been insulted and still chose professionalism. And now he was in charge. One officer leaned to another and whispered, "This is going to be different." They were right. Because for the first time in years, accountability had walked through the door. The days following Chief Brooks' speech were anything but normal. The mood inside the Fairview Police Department had shifted. An uncomfortable silence now filled the hallways where laughter and off-color jokes once echoed. Officers started watching their words. The lazy swagger some wore like a uniform was replaced with stiff postures and uncertain glances. But no one felt the tension more than Officer Jay Collins. The man who once walked around the precinct like he owned it was now walking on eggshells. Every time he passed a fellow officer, he couldn't tell if they were judging him, mocking him, or just waiting to see what happened. He didn't have to wait long. 3 days after the department meeting, Collins was called into an internal affairs hearing. When he entered the room, he saw something he hadn't expected. Body cam footage and security camera footage laid out on a screen. A camera from across the street had caught everything. The spit, the smirk, the disrespect. But it wasn't just the spitting incident that brought him there. Chief Brooks had dug deeper. Under his directive, a review of past citizen complaints had been launched. Cases that had been brushed aside were now being reopened. And Collins' record? It was far from clean. Turns out, this wasn't his first misconduct report. There were multiple use of force complaints, 2 excessive stop-and-frisk incidents involving teenagers, and a domestic disturbance report from a year prior that had quietly vanished from the system. Before Brooks, none of these had gone anywhere. But now, every file was being reviewed with fresh eyes. Collins tried to defend himself. He said the spitting was a joke, that it was taken out of context, and that he didn't know who the guy was. But that last excuse, "I didn't know who he was," that's what sealed his fate. Chief Brooks, present for the final part of the review, looked him dead in the eyes and said, "So, if I hadn't been your boss, if I was just another black man walking down the street, you still think it would have been okay to spit on me?" Collins had no answer. His voice cracked. His bravado was gone. He was suspended immediately, without pay. Not just for the spitting incident, but for the pattern of behavior that had finally been exposed. But Brooks didn't stop there. He issued a department-wide mandate. Every complaint in the past 5 years was to be audited. Every officer was to complete de-escalation and anti-bias training. And an independent oversight committee made up of community members would be formed to review ongoing misconduct cases. Some officers resisted. Others felt nervous. But many, surprisingly, welcomed the change. One junior officer said in an interview, "Honestly, we've needed this for years. There are guys like Collins who gave all of us a bad name. I'm glad someone finally said enough is enough." Community members began coming forward too. One woman shared how Collins had pulled over her 17-year-old son for looking suspicious while walking home from the library. Another man revealed a traffic stop where he was threatened with arrest for asking why he was being searched. These stories, once dismissed or silenced, now had a platform and a chief who was listening. As for Collins, his termination came 2 weeks later. No ceremony, no send-off, just a quiet HR meeting, a signature on a final report, and a walk out the front door without his badge. He didn't speak to reporters. He didn't post online. He vanished. But the message he left behind was louder than any headline. Abuse your power, and eventually, someone stronger, smarter, and better will hold you accountable. And David Brooks had done just that, without ever raising his voice. The story of Chief David Brooks and Officer Jake Collins spread through Fairview like wildfire. At first, it was just whispered between officers and residents. Then it hit local news. Then social media. Within days, it was a national headline. Racist officer spits on black man. Then learns he's the new police chief. But beyond the shock value of the title was a much deeper story. A story about dignity, discipline, and the power of calm justice. David Brooks hadn't screamed. He hadn't retaliated. He hadn't embarrassed the officer publicly in that moment. Instead, he had shown something that's becoming rare these days. Restraint in the face of disrespect. Strength without ego. Leadership without loudness. But the ripples didn't stop with one officer's termination. Under Brooks' leadership, the department started to transform from the inside out. He implemented new community engagement programs. Officers were required to walk their beats again, not just drive around in patrol cars. They had to meet the people, talk to them, know their names, their concerns, their stories. At first, there was resistance. Some officers grumbled. Others transferred out, unwilling to adapt to the new culture of accountability. But what surprised many, especially those who had written the department off as too far gone, was that most stayed. And slowly, they started to change. Brooks wasn't tyrant. He didn't punish for the sake of control. What he did was make the rules clear and fair. He celebrated good police work. He lifted up the officers who served with integrity. And he made it clear that racism, brutality, and corruption had no place under his command. One officer, who had served under the previous two chiefs, said it best during an interview. Before, we were taught to survive the job. Now, we're learning to serve in it. That's the difference. The citizens noticed, too. People who hadn't spoken to a police officer in years were now stopping by the station just to say hello. A retired teacher who had once filed a complaint that was ignored was personally invited to the new community advisory board. Teenagers who used to cross the street to avoid police were now participating in Coffee with a Cop, events every Saturday morning. Fairview was far from perfect, but the needle had moved, and it was moving fast, and it all traced back to that one moment. That spit, that smirk, that split second of open hatred. And the man who responded not with rage, but with resolve. But here's the deeper truth, the one that resonates far beyond Fairview. What Jake Collins did isn't rare. What David Brooks did is, every day, people are disrespected, discriminated against, humiliated. And while many lash out in response, which is human, few have the discipline to let justice come in its own time. Brooks understood something crucial. Real power isn't about how loud you speak or how fast you punish. It's about knowing when to speak and when to let the truth do the work. He could have had Collins arrested on the spot. He could have made a scene in front of the coffee shop. He could have gone viral for yelling back. But he didn't, because he wasn't there to prove he was powerful. He already knew that he was. Instead, he waited, watched, and then acted when the time was right, and with the full weight of the badge he wore with pride. And that's the kind of leadership people remember. That's what goes viral for the right reasons. Months later, Chief Brooks was invited to speak at a national conference on police reform. He didn't tell the crowd about the spit or the scandal. He didn't need to. He spoke about culture, about service, about the simple idea that a badge is not a shield from accountability. It's a promise of responsibility. When he finished, the room stood to its feet. And far back in the audience sat an officer from a different state. He had once been like Jake Collins, bitter, angry, careless with his words and his power. But after hearing the story, he said something to a fellow officer as they left the building. Maybe it's time I stopped thinking this job is about control. Maybe it's about character. Final reflection for viewers. So here's the question for you, the viewers. What would you do if someone spat on you in public? Would you fight back? Walk away? Or would you wait, quietly, knowing that the best revenge is truth and the best justice is earned? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, made you think, or gave you hope, Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because at the end of the day, real change doesn't come from noise. It comes from courage, character, and the quiet strength to do what's right, even when no one's watching. And sometimes, especially then,